Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. David and I find ourselves in a theater in the round.
Yes.
Which is very unique when it comes to theater because it requires a unique kind of staging.
Well, the sight lines are tricky, so if you see me sort of looking back and forth.
Exactly. We'll have that impulse to do that. It's so lovely to be with all of you here today. It's particularly lovely for me because I've known of David's work for decades. So although he is meeting me for the first time, I have known and been reading about him for years. And so this is a particular pleasure for me to think about engaging in a conversation with you today.
Well, thank you. And it's been fantastic to start to get to know you.
So on the nature, so you write for theater, you write for film, you write for television. In what ways, David, do you think about the audience and time?
Yeah, I think about the audience a lot. And time is an essential element of what it means to create theater and film and television as well. All of these dramatic forms are essentially time-generated arts. That is, we are, as opposed to a novel that an audience member might read on their own time, theater and film attempt to take a specific amount of time, take an audience through the experience, and within those parameters. So I think we're always very conscious of how it is that we're manipulating time. And there's a way that we can think of playwriting, say, falling between like a novel. A novel has characters. It has a story, similar to a play or a movie. But on the other side of the continuum, it is equally true that creating a play is like writing music. And when we think about music, we are looking at an experience also that takes place over a particular period of time where you are curating a journey for the audience. And so I think about time a lot, particularly how long is the show? How does the audience tracking it? And one of the things that we do when we create a play is we have that period called previews, where the audience is paying probably for tickets, sorry about that, but we're still working on the show. So generally, we who are on the creative team sit in the back of the theater, and yes, we're watching what's going on stage, but just as much, we're watching the audience. We're listening to the audience. The audience is teaching us about the play. And while it, I think, is generally true that individual audience members, if they give you notes, they may or may not be helpful. Probably they're not helpful. But the audience as an entity, as an organism, is almost always correct. So an example being, if I think I've written something funny and the audience doesn't laugh, then it's not the audience's fault. It may be the script's fault, or it may be the actors, it may be the director. There may be any number of factors that make this moment not work. But the audience teaches us that that moment isn't working. And similarly, this relates to the idea of time. When is the audience bored? It's really easy to track that, and you learn to sort of feel that in the room during previews. And, I think I've written something profound, but the audience is looking at their watches, or they pick up their program, or even that kind of horrible contagion of coughing that starts to happen, where it starts in, yes, thank you, starts in one place and just kind of goes around the room, and you realize, okay, I gotta move on. So I think about time a lot, and since there's some coughing, I think I should move on.
In other words, we'll feel exactly when you guys start to get bored, right? In a screenplay, I love that when we are writing a scene, there are 3 elements that become the heading for each scene. The first thing we have to list is whether or not the film is, that scene is taking place in an interior or exterior location, which has ramifications for light, for example. Then we have to list the location where that scene is actually being shot, right? And that's very crucial for the scheduling. And then we have to say whether it's day or night, right? Which also has ramifications for how many people need to be there for the crew, et cetera, et cetera. But what we don't have there is necessarily what time it is in the scene, other than knowing if it's day or night, if it's dawn or dusk, because those have a particular quality of light that sometimes, depending on what we're filming, we want to make sure is filmed at that particular time of sunrise or sunset. But what's interesting is with the last film that I shot, the cinematographer came up to me and he said, let's actually sit down and write the time of day that each of these scenes is taking place. So if this was happening at 9:30 in the morning, what time is the next scene happening at? Is it 9:45? Is it 10 a.m.? Is it an hour and a half later? And all of that became so interesting, not just as a way to think about how might the light be changing outside, but also how do we exist in a 24-hour cycle as human beings? And how can I also then use that idea of time to communicate with the actors, saying, well, this is about an hour and a half later. And then they get to think and say, well, oh yes, I might have had my coffee by now, or maybe I took a shower, or maybe this is when I normally exercise. So what kind of energy am I bringing with me into that?
And did you find that tracking the particular times in a script changed anything about the story itself, or the script, or...
What was wonderful is it made me aware of when there were flaws in understanding the logic of what might be happening. So if something was jumping from 10 a.m. and then the next scene was at night, well, then we had to really think about, well, what happened in that 8 hours in between? And is there something crucial dramatically that might have happened that actually needs to be included? Or is this where I need to go back and add a scene that's later and put it in the middle? And again, as you said, David, all of this is about orchestrating, like a compositional piece of music, your experience as you are watching it, so that we don't lose you, so that we keep you wanting to turn the page, as it were, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about something else thematically, how has the idea of history informed you as a writer?
Yeah, it's interesting that I did not grow up thinking I was going to be a writer. I was raised as a musician, but I didn't think I was going to be a musician either. I didn't know what I was going to be, probably a lawyer. And I never did a major writing project until I got to college and started writing plays, except one, which was when I was 10 years old. My maternal grandmother fell ill, and we all thought that she was going to pass away. And I was just one of these kids who was always interested in the family history. So I thought that if my grandmother passed, we would have this sort of double loss, and that obviously we would lose her, but also we would lose all this history. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and my grandparents were still living in the Philippines at the time. So I asked my parents if I could spend a summer with them, and they agreed. I went over there, and I did essentially what we would call oral histories with my grandmother. I recorded everything onto cassette tapes, and then came back home and created sort of a 90-page nonfiction novel about the history of my family, which got Xerox, got distributed to my relatives, got very good reviews. And then I never thought about writing again until I got to college. But in retrospect, it seems to me interesting that the only time that I took on a major writing project as a kid was essentially to try to contextualize myself within history, to understand what my place was. And I was an immigrant kid. I was born in the U.S., but my parents were immigrants, so I was a first-generation Chinese kid at a time when there were really no images of people like me in the mainstream media, and those that did exist, people who looked like me were either villains or usually the butt of jokes. Like when I was a kid, I remember feeling that, if I knew that there was going to be a movie or a TV show with Asian characters, I would go out of my way not to watch them. Because I just intuitively felt that there would be some moment that, would just make me feel icky, is how I would think of it as a little kid. And so history, trying to understand myself in terms of the legacy of my family at 10 was, in retrospect, a way to kind of counter that, to create an identity that felt more real to who I perceived myself to be. And so, therefore, maybe it's not surprising that as an adult, having become a dramatist, I have been consistently pretty interested in history, whether it's my second play was about the Chinese railroad workers' strike in 1867. I was like 22 when I wrote it. And these are the Chinese railroad workers who built the American Transcontinental Railroad. But they went on strike in 1867 in an incident that was little known in the early 80s when I wrote the play. And everything from that to, M. Butterfly, which is probably still my best-known play, was based on an actual incident about a French diplomat who had a 20-year affair with a Chinese actress who turned out to be A, a spy, and B, a man, and the diplomat claimed that he never knew the gender of his lover. Until more recently, I've started, I guess, putting myself into history, but in a rather unreliable fashion. So I now have several plays where there's a DHH character, but it's more of a stage mockumentary where some of it's true, but some of it I'm making up stuff. And I think this reflects the fact that writers basically hide in plain sight. So, if you're writing you might write about your breakup, the breakup of your relationship, and you hide it in the novel or play or whatever, and you think that people don't necessarily know that you're writing about your ex. But then once I named a character after myself, I realized, I had to lie because I didn't want to tell the absolute truth. And so this relationship between self and history and how you contextualize yourself within your art has been very much what I've dealt with, I think, as both a 10-year-old and an adult. It's often said that films are written at least twice, but once when their screenplay's written, and then again in editing and post. So when you're doing films that take place in a number of time periods, do you find in the edit that you change things around, or do you stick with the structure that you had in the screenplay?
I'm a very stubborn person.
Okay.
So I generally have thought through things very, very solidly and want to keep to the structure that was imposed. However, with the translator, the decision to begin in 1980 and then go again to 2000 and then 2011 made me aware of what that was demanding of you all as an audience. And the film is available on Netflix, by the way.
And was listed by the New York Times, not to be too parochial, as one of the 10 movies to stream in 2022.
Right. So, however, in the recognition that might be overwhelming for the audience, we did have a long discussion about whether or not we should instead show 1980 only in flashback. And so we went back and redid another edit of the film, because exactly as you said, there's the film you write, the film you shoot, and the film you edit, wondering if that would work. And then the trick, of course, and some of you may know this already, but within the film world, there is this aversion to the idea of the flashback, as if it is some sort of crutch that the writer or the filmmaker has used, right, in order to give you information that you need that is not somehow coming through within the context of the story itself, right, just organically. So in the end, we actually decided to let go of the flashbacks.
Great. But in general, I think flashbacks can be fine.
I do
and
too.
Voiceover can be fine. You know,
Voiceover.
the entire oeuvre of Martin Scorsese doesn't exist without voiceover.
So, David, again, on this idea of time, how do you relate to time in terms of your own mortality as a human being, or how does mortality appear within your writing?
Yeah. So, of course, you know, like all of us, I'm getting older, and we all know that you become aware of the degree to which time is more limited. I happen to have a particular brush with mortality. A little less than 10 years ago, I was stabbed in the neck on my block in Brooklyn around 9 p.m. I was carrying some groceries, and the attacker, I felt like something hit me on the back of my head, and I was like, what the F? Except I said the actual word. And then I turned and I saw someone running away, a shadowy figure. So I thought, okay, well, I'm not gonna chase him down, so I guess I'll just keep heading home. But then I found I couldn't walk straight. So I crashed first into a car, then to a wall, and then I put my hand up to where I'd been hit, and it came away covered with blood. And I realized I'd been stabbed. So it's sort of a longer story, but basically I walked, we live about 2 blocks from a hospital, fortunately, and I walked to the ER, and then I said, oh, I think I'm gonna faint now, and I fainted. And it turned out that the attacker had severed my vertebral artery, and I'd lost about 1/3 of my blood. And so, how does this relate to work? So I was writing a musical, such a strange transition. I was writing a musical with the composer Janine Tesori, and I had this concept that it would be a play that became a musical. And so I was writing the play part, this was obviously several months later, and I just felt like I just started writing about my stabbing. And I thought, oh, this is never going to get in the show. This is just something I need to do. And yet, the stabbing in the sort of completed the musical becomes the sort of fulcrum, it's the plot fulcrum that gets us from the play section to the musical. And so I just think it's an example of how art, we process what happens to us, including brushes with mortality, and they sometimes come out in surprising ways and even solve plot issues.
You were able to directly apply real life experience into channeling the pain into the art, right?
Yeah. And you've also been dealing with...
Yes, I mean, we've been sharing some stories of our personal experiences. I was standing outside the Twin Towers in New York City on 9/11 when the second airplane hit. I had just been coming up from the subway and looked up at the sky, and it was on fire. And just saw the chaos around me. And it's so strange because we've all seen scenes of violence and chaos on television, and so there's this surreal moment. I don't know if you felt this way when you were stabbed, but it's almost that you start to see yourself in a story rather than in the reality. Did you feel that way at all?
Not at the moment. In the moment, I just thought I should get to the hospital.
Right.
But I did then put it into a story. But go ahead.
And the feeling of all of what was happening will never leave me. I think as an Arab person living through that in New York, there was an added trauma of wondering what the consequences might be against your own community or yourself, or and then I was living in Syria up until the events started, and then left with my 2 small children. And again, I remember, going to a friend's house to a play date, driving to a friend's house to a play date in Damascus, and seeing the tanks roll in, and thinking, in a way, wow, life is never going to be the same here again, right? So then you start to think of, which is probably why I'm writing what I'm writing now, but is thinking about what Syria has become versus what it was. So I think those direct brushes with, wondering about your life, and then in addition, as you said, to getting older, there's another thing that I notice that's happening with me, which is that I think as somebody who creates, there's a lot of thinking that goes on about what you hope to accomplish in your own lifetime, right? Oh, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to say this, I want to tell this, blah, 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 blah. And lately, I've just started to chill out a bit. And I have this feeling now, well, if I don't tell that story, another generation will, right? And I think that that's also, time becomes interesting also as an educator, right? We both work in universities where we actually get to pass on, right? Carry, we recognize that the torch has been passed to us, but then also that we are now passing it on to a next generation who will continue to tell stories, as we always have as a species. But maybe we could do 2 things. Either open it up for a question, or I could ask a burning question that I've had for David, which is that he has the unique distinction of having worked with Prince. And that might be interesting as we start to think of mortality and time.
Okay, I guess I'll tell the Prince story. No, I've always, when I was a kid, the 2 pop stars that meant the most to me were David Bowie and Prince, and I fortunately had the opportunity to get to work with both of them in one way or another. But in Prince's case, he'd seen M. Butterfly on Broadway, and nobody told me he was coming, so I was like, well, guys. But then I eventually got a phone call from Paisley Park, and they were like, oh, Prince wants to talk to you, and this was before cell phones and everything, and he may call tomorrow. So I just sort of sit by my phone all day, right? And then he doesn't call. And they, at the end, was like, okay, he might call tomorrow. I'm sorry, he didn't make it. Anyway, so after about 3 days, the phone finally rings, and it's Prince. And he's like, hello. And I was like, oh, thank you for calling me and wanting to talk to me. I've been so thrilled about that. And then silence on the other side of the phone. So I'm like, and I know all your albums. It goes all the way back to, anyway. Eventually, he started talking, and he had an idea for a musical. And then I met him. He was at a hotel in New York, and he met me in full Prince drag. He was in costume, he was in the heels, he had the makeup on, he looked just like Prince. And we eventually, the project that we did, the musical never happened, but he wanted me to write some spoken word. He wanted to put a spoken word section into the middle of a song. So I sent him, I faxed him some text, and then 2 days later I get a FedEx with a cassette, and he's incorporated it into a song. And then a year later, I hear from Paisley Park that's going to be the B-side of the single. and which was, very honorable. It's not like we had written anything down. And then then I have a gold record now on my wall, which is the best piece of fan memorabilia that anyone could ever ask for. That's my Prince story. Oh, and by the way, Prince, of course, is no longer on this planet, and yet he is. So, talk about mortality.
So I think we have just 1 minute left. I didn't know if anybody might have a question. Yes, please.
In 1 minute for both of you. Thank you. Have either or both of you ever tried to alter your audience's perception of time in your work?
I'll give two answers, I think, really quick. One, yes, you want the audience to think that less time has passed than has actually passed. And number two, I've written, I think, 5 shows with Philip Glass, and Philip's music also tries to change the perception of time. Oh, sorry, go.
Amazing. In one of my short films, Mare Nostrum, there's a scene in which you don't know if we've got into a dream or not. And I think that was part of me wanting to alter their sense of time. Thank you all so much. Thank you.